So, if you introduce, like, just imagine you're a teacher, and if you introduce these social web tools to the kids, do you think it's necessary? Oh, my voice. Do you think it's necessary that there is also a theory behind all this? How does a network function? How is it to live within a network? Do you think it's necessary to teach the kids this as well?
Well, first of all, I'm biased toward theory, so I think theory has a very valuable role in influencing practice and in driving practice. So absolutely, I do think that's important. To what degree is that critical? I guess it varies. I mean, I came from a community where individuals acquired competence not by abiding by theory, but by doing. And so they were capable of, if you could fix, I don't know, a tractor or a combine or, it didn't matter if you knew the theory. The only point of evaluation was what was the outcome, what was the end product. So I think theory has a particular role in certain academic settings, and it perhaps has less of a role in other settings, even though it's worth noting that all technology is, in a sense, embedded philosophy. So whether you acknowledge the theory that exists or not, it's still going to exist because it can be an underlying strand that sort of runs through the entire experience. But I just want to briefly address this notion of networks, because we talk a lot about networks and we hear a lot about networks, and I think that's the wrong focus, actually. I think the real focus has to be on connections, because networks are patterns of connections, right? We can't interact with networks in the same way that we interact with a connection. So let's say, I'll just give you an example. Let's say someone says, when you take a group of individuals that are in the various boards of different corporations, and you start to realize, oh, there's certain patterns that exist here. That pattern is useful, but a network is sort of a high-level abstraction you can't directly interact with. When you reduce it down to a unit of change that we can control, it's a connection. I mean, we can't control an entire network as individuals. We can form individual connections. We can control the formation of connections.
Do we need to control a network? We don't need to control a network.
Well, if control or influence, understand. So I think the point with my view, or my, not necessarily negative view, my view is that a lot of instances we are focused on networks as systems or as structures, and yet it's a focus that removes us from the capacity to influence and direct and control, because it's the connections, it's the individual connections. If I'm a teacher in a classroom, the way in which the students are connected is my most important question. If I was to look at and create, and evaluate structural holds and evaluate these kinds of perspectives on it, to me that's not nearly as practical as understanding why did, Mary's conceptual network of a topic form the way it did. Why did June's perspective of a topic evolve and adjust based on her interaction with Ted? And so it's the sense, if I was to say, give me a network diagram of students in a classroom, and I would look at that network diagram and it would look very nice, and I would use terms and say, well, 80% of people have limited connections, 20% have enormous connections. I would use terms like power laws and the long tail to describe that. And yet in the end, and this is for me, the view is a connection is a unit of change that an individual can influence.
But, sorry.
So I'll leave it there.
But wouldn't you say that a network is much more than the sum of all the connections within the network?
Because I think a network is a pattern. I don't think it reflects things. A network is it's a map, in a sense, of what exists there. I would probably try and flip that the opposite and say that the connections are more than the sum of the network, because understanding the connections and understanding how and why they form so that we can influence them productively, because as a teacher, that's our real question, or as an educator, the real question is how can we create a space that is open enough for individuals to form novel and innovative and creative connections. And these things can't always be rendered into networks. For example, there was the Christmas Day bomber that was a big issue, and one of the statements that I think it was actually Obama made was that we were collecting but not connecting the information. And so what was happening was that you had these different bodies, these different government agencies, and yes, they were networked. They were somehow structurally related to each other. And yet, for whatever reason, the important pieces of information were not being connected. So what's the value of the network there, right? In that sense, you could say, well, this agency has arrangement of information sharing with this agency and with that agency, and yet for some reason, we weren't, to gain an accurate understanding, we weren't connecting the right elements to gain an accurate conceptual understanding of what's existing. And so in some regard, and this is basically the point of my talk tomorrow, is that the unit of change that we need to focus on at a classroom level, at an educational level, is literally connections. How and why do they form? The networks are a nice-to-have background map and image that we can look at later, or even during, to provide us with some guidance. But the critical issue is understanding those connections.
Doesn't the network give you some kind of evaluation? What's going on in all these connections?
Sure. I mean, and then like I said, the network is a pattern. And so essentially it does do that. And I guess it's a difficult analogy to try and create and to flesh out. And I think over time, we'll gain a better understanding of this connected focus, not the network, because the network is too large an abstraction of a unit of change in order to be really meaningful to individuals. Mm-hmm. It's almost a sense of, let's say when science discovered the atom. And it seemed, it's far easier in science to think about the whole body rather than the atom. Like, why understand the atom? Like, the atom is, and it didn't make sense. I mean, it was, you couldn't see it. If you wanted to explain the world and the physical phenomenon of the world around, it was far easier to use other words and other concepts to explain it. But to say the atom and how atoms form, even something as simple as DNA, where humans share a huge percentage of our DNA with something as simple as an earthworm or a flatworm, and what's unique is the connectedness of those. It's the way in which connections form that produces the different kind of structures. And so in that regard, I think in education, a return or a heavy focus on connections should be the starting point of the entire educational system, rather than a broad-based overview where we try and always see things at a larger level and then try and make sense of those pieces. By reducing things down to connections and seeing that this is the starting point of the experience, much like, we've advanced beyond just simply seeing atoms now, but much like this recognition that one individual unit, one notion, one concept can really serve as a basis for describing the physical world. In a similar sense, this one notion of connections and connectedness may well serve as a suitable foundation for understanding the educational system and understanding learning and understanding the flow of information and those kinds of things.